My family flew across 15 states to attend my sister's gender reveal party, but when I got married, not a single one of them showed up. My husband looked at the empty pews and told me they would regret this. 20 days later, my phone exploded with 129 missed calls. They finally found out who my husband really was, and it cost them absolutely everything. My name is Cassidy, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. I stood in the bridal suite of a historic downtown Chicago church, staring at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The white silk of my wedding gown felt heavy against my skin. The room was perfectly quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the wall. There were exactly 10 minutes left until I was supposed to walk down the aisle. 10 minutes until the music would start playing and the heavy wooden doors would open. My hands were shaking slightly as I reached up to adjust the delicate lace edge of my veil. I had spent months planning this day, meticulously organizing every single detail with the precision that made me so good at my job as a forensic accountant. I thrived on order, on numbers matching up, on everything being exactly where it was supposed to be. But the one thing that was not where it was supposed to be was my family. The bridal suite should have been chaotic. It should have been filled with the sounds of my mother Caroline fussing over my hair, or my sister Brittany complaining about her bridesmaid dress, or my father Richard practicing his speech for the reception. Instead, there was just me and the suffocating silence. I kept glancing at the door, expecting them to burst in at any second with some elaborate excuse about Chicago traffic. They loved elaborate excuses. They lived for the drama of arriving late and making an entrance. Suddenly, the sharp buzz of my phone vibrating against the glass vanity table shattered the quiet. I lunged for it, my heart leaping into my throat. The screen lit up with a new text message from my mother. I unlocked the phone and read the words that would fundamentally change the course of my entire life. Brittany's gender reveal party got moved up to today. We flew to Miami. Dion's VIP tech investors will be there, and your sister really needs our support right now. You are just doing a small city hall style thing anyway, so handle it yourself. Send pics. I read the message again and then a third time. My brain, an analytical machine trained to dissect complex corporate fraud, struggled to process the sheer audacity of those 40 words. They flew to Miami, today, on my wedding day. I thought about Dion, my African-American brother-in-law, who had always played the part of the brilliant Silicon Valley tech genius perfectly. He wore custom-tailored suits, flashed his expensive watches, and charmed my parents into absolute submission. My mother and father worshipped the ground he walked on because he represented the flashy wealth and social status they craved in their North Shore country club circles. Brittany, my younger sister, had always been their golden child, the beautiful lifestyle influencer who could do no wrong. Together, Brittany and Dion were the ultimate power couple in my parents' eyes. And I was just Cassidy, the cold, logical accountant, the boring daughter who investigated financial discrepancies for a living. The daughter who had supposedly settled for a simple, mundane life. You are just doing a small city hall-style thing anyway. The words echoed in my mind, mocking me. I had specifically invited them to this beautiful historic church. I had paid for premium floral arrangements, a string quartet, and a catered reception out of my own pocket. But in their minds, because I was not marrying a flashy tech executive with VIP investors, my wedding was nothing more than a trivial errand that did not warrant their presence. They had chosen a gender reveal party over my wedding day because there were wealthy investors to impress in Miami. A strange numbness washed over me, replacing the initial shock. I set the phone down on the vanity table face down. I did not cry. I had spent my entire adult life crying over their casual cruelty and blatant favoritism. I had cried when they skipped my master's degree graduation to go shopping with Brittany. I had cried when they used the deed to my first home as leverage to help fund Dion's startup company. I was absolutely done crying. I gathered the heavy skirts of my silk gown and walked out of the bridal suite. The hallway was lined with dark wood paneling and smelled faintly of old paper and burning candles. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor as I made my way toward the sanctuary. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed visual confirmation of the betrayal to finally kill the last remaining shred of hope I held for my family. I pushed open the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel. The interior was breathtakingly beautiful. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful prisms across the wooden pews. The string quartet was softly tuning their instruments near the altar. The scent of white roses and eucalyptus filled the air. It was the perfect setting for a perfect day. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my eyes fixed on the front row on the left side. The bride's side. There they were. 15 premium velvet chairs, set apart from the rest of the seating. I had carefully printed elegant name cards for each one. Caroline, Richard, Brittany, Dion, aunts, uncles, cousins, 15 people who shared my blood, 15 people who had smiled to my face and promised they would be here to celebrate the most important day of my life. Every single one of those 15 chairs was completely empty. I stood at the end of the aisle staring at the pristine white name cards resting on the vacant velvet seats. The reality of my isolation settled over me like a heavy winter coat. They had actually done it. They had abandoned me at the altar not out of malice or anger, but out of something far worse. They abandoned me out of pure, unadulterated indifference. To them, impressing Dion's wealthy friends in Florida was simply a higher priority than witnessing my marriage vows. I did not feel the urge to scream or throw a tantrum. The forensic accountant inside me simply registered this as a final, undeniable data point. The ledger was closed. The balance was zero. As I stood there looking at the empty row, the final remnants of my familial loyalty evaporated into the cold church air, leaving behind nothing but a quiet, chilling clarity about what I had to do next. I turned on my heel and marched back down the aisle. My heavy silk dress swished against the marble floor, but the sound was drowned out by the roaring in my ears. I pushed open the door to the bridal suite and let it shut behind me. The quiet of the room felt oppressive now. I walked straight to the vanity mirror and gripped the edges of the table. My reflection stared back, pale but composed. The tears never came. Instead, a hot, sharp anger flared in my chest. I reached up and grabbed the delicate lace veil that my mother had insisted I buy, the one she promised she would help me pin into place. I started pulling the bobby pins out of my hair, tossing them onto the glass tabletop with sharp metallic clicks. One by one, I removed the pins, letting the expensive fabric fall to the floor. It felt like shedding a skin I no longer wanted to wear. My family had always made me feel like an afterthought, a convenient backup plan, and I was finally accepting the reality of my position in their lives. The door creaked open and I saw him in the mirror reflection. Harrison stepped into the room, gently closing the door behind him. Harrison was 36 years old, and he was the absolute love of my life. He stood there in a plain off-the-rack navy suit, looking handsome, but entirely unremarkable to the untrained eye. That was exactly how he preferred it. When I first introduced him to my parents, they had dismissed him almost immediately. He drove an old Volvo station wagon, wore plain cotton shirts on the weekends, and never talked about his income. My mother had actually pulled me aside after our first dinner together to ask if he could even afford to take me to a decent restaurant. They thought he was a low-level corporate drone, a mid-management paper pusher who would never amount to anything special. They constantly compared him to Dion, with his tailored designer suits and leased luxury sports cars. My family measured a man by the logos on his shoes and the reservations he could secure. They had no idea Harrison chose his plain suits deliberately, as a comfortable armor he wore to navigate a world demanding his attention. They only saw what he allowed them to see, and they judged him for it just as harshly as they judged me. He walked over and placed his hands on my bare shoulders, his touch grounding me instantly. He looked at the discarded veil on the floor, then at my reflection in the mirror. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell me that everything would be okay. He just waited, giving me the space to speak. I leaned back against him, closing my eyes for a brief second before opening them to meet his gaze in the glass. "They are not coming. I said, my voice dangerously calm. They flew to Miami this morning for the gender reveal party. Harrison's jaw tightened, but his expression remained steady. All 15 of them. I continued, the words tumbling out of me like sharp stones. I just walked out to the sanctuary. The entire row is empty. I pulled away from him and began pacing the small room, the heavy fabric of my dress restricting my movements. It is always like this, Harrison. It has always been like this. When I got my master's degree in forensic accounting, they were shopping for an engagement ring for Brittany. They missed my graduation ceremony because she needed their opinion on a diamond. I stopped pacing and turned to face him, my hands balling into fists at my sides. When I bought my first house, the one I saved for years to afford, they did not even congratulate me. Instead, they asked me to leverage it to fund the startup for Dion. My father sat me down and told me that family supports family, and that my house equity could be the seed money for a brilliant tech vision by Dion. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. I refused, and my mother told me I was a selfish, bitter woman who could not stand to see my sister happy. And now my wedding. They could not even give me one single afternoon. Harrison closed the distance between us, taking my hands in his. His thumbs rubbed soothing circles over my knuckles. They think they can just treat us like disposable background characters in their grand, glamorous lives, I whispered, the anger finally cracking my voice. They think my career is a joke, my life is boring, and our marriage is an inconvenience. They think Dion and Brittany are the future of this family, and I am just the disappointing accountant who refuses to play along. I pulled my hands away from his grasp and walked back to the vanity table. I picked up a silver hairbrush and ran my fingers over the smooth metal back, focusing on the cold sensation against my skin. They really flew across 15 states to attend a party for an unborn child rather than walk me down the aisle. My mother could not even be bothered to call me. She sent a text message. A careless, thoughtless text message telling me to handle my own wedding because my sister needed her more. It is breathtaking how little I mean to them. Harrison watched me carefully, his blue eyes analyzing every shift in my posture. He stepped forward again and gently took the hairbrush out of my trembling hand, placing it back on the table. He did not look angry or surprised. He just looked incredibly focused. His silence was not empty, it was calculating. The kind of silence that precedes a storm. He stood beside me, staring at our reflection in the mirror, his mind clearly working through a plan. Harrison did not pull me into a tight embrace. He did not stroke my hair and whisper that everything happens for a reason, or that we only needed each other today. Those were the cliché lines of a typical groom trying to soothe a heartbroken bride, but my husband was not a typical man. His eyes narrowed slightly as he turned away from the mirror and looked directly at me. The warm, gentle demeanor of the man I loved shifted, completely dissolving into something entirely different. The soft lines of his face hardened, and the casual posture he usually maintained vanished, replaced by a rigid, predatory stillness. He held out his hand, palm up. "Give me your phone, Cassidy." I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my mind struggling to bridge the gap between the man who had kissed me softly this morning and the cold, calculating presence standing before me now. I reached over to the glass vanity table, picked up my device, and placed it into his waiting hand. He unlocked the screen, navigating straight past the messages from my mother and opening the camera application. "Stay here for a moment," he instructed, his voice dropping an octave, carrying an authoritative weight that I had never heard him use before. But I could not just stay in that suffocating room. I gathered the heavy silk of my dress and followed him out into the dimly lit hallway, trailing a few steps behind. My heels clicked softly on the marble floors, tracing his path toward the main sanctuary. Harrison pushed open the heavy wooden doors with a deliberate, forceful push that echoed through the quiet church. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note, looking up in surprise, but Harrison ignored them completely. He marched straight down the center aisle, his plain suit contrasting sharply with the opulent surroundings. He stopped right in front of the first row on the left side, the 15 vacant seats bearing the pristine white name cards of my absent relatives. He raised the phone carefully, framing the shot to include every single empty velvet chair, the ornate floral arrangements framing the vacant space, and the stained glass windows casting colorful light across the undeniable evidence of their betrayal. The shutter clicked with a sharp artificial sound that somehow felt louder than a gunshot in the silent chapel. He lowered the phone and immediately opened the messaging application. I stood a few feet away, watching his thumbs move rapidly across the digital keyboard. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly in the vast empty space of the sanctuary. I stepped closer, trying to see the screen over his shoulder. He navigated to the large family group chat, a thread that had been buzzing all morning with photos of my sister Brittany posing on a rented yacht in Miami and my parents holding champagne flutes next to Dion. Harrison uploaded the stark high-resolution photograph of the empty pews. He did not type a long emotional paragraph explaining my pain or demanding an apology. He did not plead for their attention or express any sadness over their absence. Instead, he typed a single devastating sentence: "You just missed your very last chance to be saved." He hit send before I could even process the words. I stared at him, completely shocked by the aggressive finality of the message. "Harrison," I breathed, my eyes wide. "My mother is going to use that against me. She will tell everyone I am threatening them. She will twist this to make me look like the unstable, jealous sister again." Harrison slowly turned to face me, slipping the phone into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. His expression was devoid of any humor or warmth. "Let her try," he said, his voice carrying a chilling absolute certainty. "Let her show that message to her country club friends, to Dion and his fake investors, to anyone who will listen. They think they are invincible because they are standing on a yacht in Florida, surrounded by people they perceive as important. They think you are weak because you chose a quiet life with a man who drives a battered Volvo. They have spent your entire life treating your existence as a footnote in their grand narrative." He stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His hands reached up to cup my face, his thumbs tracing the line of my jaw with surprising gentleness, despite the dark intensity in his eyes. "Listen to me, Cassidy. I am not going to offer you empty comforts today. I am not going to tell you to forgive them or to take the high road because they are family. Blood does not give them the right to treat you like collateral damage. They made a choice today. They chose the illusion of wealth and status over their own flesh and blood, and now they are going to pay the price for that choice." I looked up into his striking blue eyes, mesmerized by the sheer force of his conviction. The man standing before me was not the quiet, unassuming partner my family had mocked. He was a force of nature entirely focused on my vindication. By the end of this month, he promised, every word deliberate and measured, they will be begging on their knees for your financial mercy. They will realize exactly who they abandoned and exactly who you married. The fake empire Dion built, the mansion your parents leveraged to fund his lies, the glamorous influencer lifestyle your sister flaunts online, it will all crumble to dust. I will tear down their entire world brick by brick, and I will drop the deed to their destruction right at your feet." A shiver ran down my spine. I finally had a champion. He offered me his arm. "Let us go walk down the aisle and get married right now, my beautiful bride." I took a deep breath, letting the cool air of the sanctuary fill my lungs, and placed my hand in the crook of his arm. We did not do the traditional procession. There was no father waiting to walk me down the aisle to give me away like a piece of property in a corporate merger. There was only Harrison standing beside me as an equal partner, guiding me forward. As the string quartet transitioned into a soft, swelling melody, we stepped into the light together. Walking down that long center aisle, the contrast between the two sides of the church was stark and deeply poetic. On my left, the 15 velvet chairs sat vacant, a silent monument to the conditional love I had endured my entire life. But on my right, the pews were filled with people who actually mattered. Harrison had invited a small, fiercely loyal group of friends and colleagues, people who knew the real him and who had welcomed me with open arms. They looked at us with genuine warmth, their smiles completely devoid of the calculating transactional assessment my parents always wore. They did not care about the brand of my dress or the venue we had chosen. They were simply there to witness two people committing to each other. We reached the altar, and the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel closed with a resounding thud, sealing us inside this sacred space. The officiant, an older man with a gentle demeanor, began to speak about the foundation of marriage. He spoke of trust, of mutual respect, and of building a shelter against the unpredictable storms of the world. As I listened to his words, my mind briefly flashed to my sister Brittany and her husband Dayon. Their marriage was a carefully curated performance for social media, a relentless pursuit of status built on a foundation of lies and borrowed money. My parents viewed relationships as investments, constantly calculating the return on their emotional capital. If you did not provide a high enough yield in the form of prestige or public envy, you were discarded. Standing there holding Harrison by the hands, I realized that I was finally breaking that cycle. Our bond was not a business transaction to be audited. It was real, grounded in shared values and a profound quiet strength. Harrison looked down at me, his thumb gently stroking my palm, pulling my focus back to the present moment. The warmth radiating from his touch was a stark departure from the cold, sterile environment I had grown up in. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me, washing away the last lingering shadows of my family and their cruel abandonment. It was time for our vows. We had chosen to write our own wanting this commitment, to reflect the unique journey that had brought us together. Harrison spoke first, his voice clear and resonant, carrying effortlessly through the quiet church. He did not recite poetry or offer grand theatrical promises. His words were precise, intentional, and deeply moving. He promised to be my shield when the world tried to break me, and my anchor when I felt adrift. He vowed to never let anyone diminish my worth, to always see the brilliance that others were too blind to recognize, and to build an empire with me where only truth and loyalty were permitted to reside. Every word he spoke felt like a deliberate countermeasure to the years of emotional neglect I had suffered. When it was my turn, my voice trembled slightly, but not from fear. I looked into his bright blue eyes and promised to be his steadfast partner in all things. I vowed to match his loyalty with my own, to stand by his side through every battle, and to create a home with him that was defined by safety, transparency, and unconditional support. I told him that he was the first place I had ever truly belonged. We exchanged the rings, slipping the elegant gold bands onto each of our fingers. The weight of the metal was a physical reminder of the permanent bond we had just forged. It was not a flashy diamond meant to impress superficial investors, but a solid, enduring symbol of our unbreakable alliance. The officiant smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and pronounced us husband and wife. Harrison leaned in and kissed me, a deep, grounding kiss that sealed our promise to the world and to each other. The sanctuary erupted in applause. It was not the polite golf clap of a country club gathering, but the loud, enthusiastic cheering of people who genuinely cared for us. We turned to face our chosen family, our fingers tightly interlaced, and began the walk back down the aisle. I did not look at the empty chairs on the left. They no longer held any power over me. My gaze was fixed firmly on the bright sunlight spilling through the open doors at the end of the corridor, illuminating the path to our new life. As we finally stepped out of the heavy church doors and into the crisp Chicago afternoon, the absolute reality of what we had just done settled over me. A gentle, crisp breeze caught the heavy edge of my silk dress, carrying the scent of autumn air. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown and pulled out my cellular device. The screen was already flooded with notification banners, undoubtedly a frantic reaction to the photograph Harrison had posted in the family chat just minutes prior. I did not read a single word. I did not care what lies or excuses they were frantically typing from their sunny beach in Florida. With a calm, deliberate motion, I held down the power button and watched the brightly illuminated screen slowly fade to black. I slipped the silent phone back into my pocket, completely severing their access to my world. The 20-day silence had officially begun. The first week of my marriage passed in a state of absolute tranquility. Harrison and I settled into our temporary apartment, enjoying the quiet intimacy of our new life together. I kept my personal cellular device powered down, leaving it buried in the bottom drawer of my desk. The silence from my family was deafening yet entirely predictable. They did not try to call my work number. They did not send a brief email to ask how the ceremony went. They did not even bother to have a generic bouquet of flowers delivered to my office. It was as if my wedding, and by extension my entire existence, had been completely erased from their collective memory. They were punishing me for Harrison sending that photograph of the empty pews. Their tactic was classic manipulation. They believed that by ignoring me, I would eventually cave under the weight of my own isolation and reach out to apologize for making them feel guilty. But I was no longer playing their exhausting, endless game of chasing approval that would simply never arrive. Instead of breaking down, I calmly observed them from a distance. My professional life as a corporate forensic accountant required me to continuously monitor digital footprints, and my family was currently leaving a massive, glaring trail of evidence across every single social media platform available. By the beginning of the second week, my sister Brittany had significantly escalated her online presence to an absolutely obnoxious level. I sat comfortably at my home office desk, sipping hot black coffee, and quietly watched the bizarre performance unfold on my high-resolution laptop screen. Brittany posted dozens of updates every single day from a luxury yacht moored off the coast of Miami. The photos were carefully curated to showcase maximum wealth and excess. There were wide-angle shots of the pristine blue ocean, close-ups of catered seafood spreads, and endless videos of the yacht cutting through the waves. The center of all this manufactured glamour was always her husband Dion. At 32 years old, the African-American tech chief executive officer knew exactly how to play to the camera. He wore custom-tailored linen suits, flashed a heavy gold watch on his wrist, and smiled with the practiced ease of a man who believed he was untouchable. In one particularly grating video, Dion stood on the sun deck holding a massive bottle of expensive champagne. He popped the cork with a loud cheer, the sparkling wine spraying over the edge of the boat. My parents, Richard and Caroline, were standing right beside him, holding out crystal flutes and laughing like teenagers. My mother looked absolutely thrilled, her eyes shining with the kind of unfiltered joy she had never once directed toward me. My father patted Dion on the back, looking at his son-in-law with a level of pride and admiration that made my stomach turn. They were toasting to Dion and his supposed genius, completely captivated by the flashy lifestyle he provided. They looked like the perfect, wealthy, successful family. But looking closely at the high-definition images, my trained eyes caught the tiny, subtle details that revealed the truth. The tension in the jaw of my father when the camera was not directly on him. The way my mother anxiously adjusted her designer sunglasses, looking around to see who was watching them. They were performing desperate to maintain their status among the invisible audience of their peers. The climax of their digital gaslighting campaign arrived on the 14th day of my silence. Brittany uploaded a carousel of highly edited photographs from a private beach club. The first image featured her and Dion kissing under a cabana. The second showed my parents toasting with tropical drinks. But it was the caption beneath the photos that caught my full attention. She wrote that real families support massive successes, and if anyone is jealous, that is simply a personal problem. It was a direct, passive-aggressive strike aimed squarely at me. She was trying to provoke a reaction, trying to drag me into a public argument where she could play the victim and paint me as the bitter, unsuccessful sister who could not handle being overshadowed. In the past, a comment like that would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and self-doubt. I would have drafted a dozen different responses, trying to defend myself, trying to make them understand how much they had hurt me by abandoning me on my wedding day. But as I sat in my quiet office staring at the glowing screen, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no urge to retaliate. The emotional manipulation simply did not work anymore. I zoomed in on the background of the photograph, my mind automatically shifting into forensic analysis mode. I noted the name of the beach club, the brand of the champagne they were drinking, and the specific model of the luxury watch Dion was wearing. Every single post, every boastful caption, and every excessive display of extreme wealth was another crucial data point for my quiet investigation. They honestly thought they were flaunting their absolute victory over me, but they were actually just meticulously documenting their own glaring financial anomalies for the upcoming federal audit. I closed the browser window and took another sip of my coffee. I refused to take the bait. I would not give them the satisfaction of a response, nor would I allow their toxic performance to disrupt the peace I had finally found with Harrison. Let them drink champagne. Let them bask in the fake adoration of their online followers. Let them believe they had won the ultimate family competition. Their arrogance blinded them to the reality of their situation. They were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely unaware that the hull was already taking on water. And I was perfectly content to sit back and watch them celebrate while the ocean prepared to swallow them whole. The transition from our quiet temporary apartment to the beating heart of downtown Chicago was a journey between two entirely different universes. While my family continued their ridiculous performance on a rented yacht in Miami, completely convinced of their own superiority, the real power in this story was quietly gathering force on the top floor of a high-security skyscraper. This glass and steel monolith dominated the city skyline, a physical manifestation of absolute financial authority. The massive structural foundation of the building itself seemed designed to intimidate anyone who dared to approach its towering entrance. It was a place where ordinary rules did not apply. At all. To enter the building required passing through multiple layers of heavily armed security and biometric scanners. The lobby was lined with imported Italian marble, and the private elevators required a specialized encrypted keycard to access the highest levels. This was the fortress of Apex Capital, a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm that operated with ruthless precision in the shadows of the global financial market. The elevator doors slid open silently on the 60th floor, revealing an expansive office suite that hummed with intense, focused energy. Dozens of analysts, investment bankers, and corporate lawyers moved rapidly across the polished floors, their voices reduced to urgent whispers. When the elevator chimes sounded, a sudden and noticeable shift occurred in the room. The frantic movement paused, and every single person turned their attention toward the doors. Harrison stepped out of the elevator wearing the exact same plain navy suit he had worn to our wedding. He held a simple leather briefcase in one hand, and his posture was completely relaxed. To my parents and my sister Brittany, he was nothing more than a boring mid-level employee who drove a battered Volvo and lacked any real ambition. They had mocked his plain clothes and quiet demeanor, assuming his lack of flashy designer labels meant a lack of financial success. They were tragically, profoundly mistaken. Harrison did not work for Apex Capital. He was the founder and the chief executive officer. He owned the entire firm. The men and women in the expensive tailored suits, the ones wearing the heavy gold watches and carrying the prestigious degrees, rushed forward the moment his foot touched the floor. Senior vice presidents and managing partners scrambled to hand him confidential files and brief him on overnight market fluctuations. Harrison moved through the crowd of executives with the effortless grace of an apex predator returning to his territory. He did not need to raise his voice to command respect. His mere presence demanded it. He nodded to his chief operating officer, accepted a stack of heavily redacted documents, and walked straight into his corner office. The room was massive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panoramic view of the entire city of Chicago. Harrison took a seat behind a massive desk carved from a single slab of reclaimed walnut. He placed his briefcase on the floor and began sorting through the morning briefs. The business model of Apex Capital was not built on creating flashy applications or selling imaginary technological revolutions to gullible investors. Apex Capital was a financial executioner. Harrison built his empire by identifying failing bloated companies acquiring their debt at a steep discount, initiating hostile takeovers, and systematically dismantling them for parts. He was a master at finding the hidden rot inside a corporate structure, exposing the lies of incompetent founders and liquidating their assets to recover investor capital. It was a brutal, unforgiving industry, and Harrison was universally feared and respected as the undisputed king of corporate restructuring. He had the power to freeze accounts, seize properties, and destroy legacies with a single stroke of his pen. Among the stack of urgent documents placed on his desk was a thick red file folder marked for his immediate personal review. Harrison reached out and opened the cover, his bright blue eyes scanning the executive summary printed on the first page. The document detailed a highly publicized Silicon Valley technology startup that had recently been aggressively seeking a massive infusion of bridge loan capital. The company was burning through cash at an alarming rate, and conventional banks had already refused to extend their credit lines. The startup was desperately looking for a private equity savior to bail them out before their creditors forced them into involuntary bankruptcy. Harrison read the name of the founder and chief executive officer listed at the top of the financial disclosure form. The name was printed in bold black letters. Dion. It was the exact same Dion who was currently popping expensive champagne on a yacht in Miami, celebrating a fake gender reveal party with my parents. It was the same Dion whose flashy lifestyle and custom suits had convinced my mother and father to leverage their historic North Shore mansion to fund his supposed genius. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, and a slow, chilling smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a hunter who had just watched his prey willingly walk directly into a steel trap. He had promised me in the bridal suite that he would tear down their world brick by brick, and the universe had just handed him the sledgehammer. Harrison picked up the red file and slowly stood from his desk. He walked over to the sleek silver intercom system mounted on the wall and pressed the button. His voice echoed clearly through the secure speaker system connected directly to the adjacent office suite. "Cassidy," he said, his tone perfectly level but carrying a deep undercurrent of dark, eager anticipation. "I need you to come into my corner office right now. We just received a brand new acquisition target that requires your very specific set of skills and expertise. I have a very strong feeling that you are going to find their internal accounting practices to be extremely interesting. It is time to go to work, my love." I walked into the expansive corner office and took the heavy red file folder from his outstretched hand. The smooth leather binding felt substantial against my skin, representing the entire fabricated existence of my brother-in-law. I did not say a word as I turned around and carried the dossier down the glass-walled corridor to my personal workstation. My office was a specialized sanctuary designed specifically for the meticulous deconstruction of corporate deception. 6 high-resolution monitors were mounted in a seamless arc across my desk, glowing with proprietary data analysis software that Apex Capital used to dissect acquiring targets. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, logged into the secure terminal, and opened the initial digital disclosures Dion had submitted to our firm. Forensic accounting is often misunderstood by the general public as a tedious exercise in basic mathematics, but it is actually much closer to a digital autopsy. Every single transaction leaves a unique footprint, and every manipulated spreadsheet tells a hidden story of human greed. I cracked my knuckles, poised my fingers over the mechanical keyboard, and began to slice into the financial anatomy of his heavily hyped technology startup. The public narrative surrounding Dion claimed he was a visionary pioneer who had developed a revolutionary artificial intelligence algorithm. He had graced the covers of minor business magazines and secured glowing profiles on technology blogs by promising investors astronomical returns on an unproven software platform. I started my investigation by executing a targeted search query for research and development expenditures. A technology company valued at this supposed magnitude should have been burning through massive amounts of capital to pay elite software engineers, secure intellectual property rights, and purchase high-end server infrastructure. I ran the diagnostic script across 3 years of his provided bank statements and watched the results populate on my third monitor. The numbers were staggering, but not in the way Dion wanted potential buyers to believe. There was absolutely no meaningful capital allocated to technological development. The proprietary algorithm did not exist. He had hired a handful of cheap overseas contractors to build a visually impressive user interface that functioned as nothing more than a hollow shell. The groundbreaking technology was a complete phantom designed solely to dazzle technologically illiterate investors like my parents. If the company was not spending capital on engineering, I needed to find out exactly where the millions of dollars in venture funding were actually going. I deployed a secondary algorithm designed to track the velocity and destination of incoming wire transfers. The data visualization software began mapping a complex web of interconnected bank accounts stretching across multiple domestic and international jurisdictions. I watched the digital lines connect on my screens, revealing a textbook financial crime. Dion was running a classic Ponzi scheme. He was actively soliciting fresh capital from new investors and immediately diverting those funds to pay fabricated dividend returns to his early backers, creating the powerful illusion of a highly profitable enterprise. The sheer arrogance of his financial structure was breathtaking. He had not even bothered to sophisticatedly launder the majority of the incoming cash. He simply moved it through a series of hollow shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada before filtering it out into the dark waters of international banking. I leaned closer to the screens, my eyes tracing the largest outbound cash flows. The bleeding was severe and continuous. Millions of dollars were being systematically siphoned away from the primary corporate accounts and wired directly into opaque offshore trusts located in the Cayman Islands. These specific accounts were notoriously difficult to penetrate, but Apex Capital possessed specialized software tools that allowed me to pierce the corporate veil. I executed a brute force data extraction protocol and waited as the processing bar slowly filled across my center monitor. When the decrypted ledger finally appeared, I felt a cold surge of absolute vindication. Dion had diverted over $12 million of stolen investor capital into private Caribbean accounts over the past 24 months. He was deliberately bleeding his own startup dry, preparing for the inevitable moment when the entire fraudulent structure collapsed under its own weight. But the offshore accounts only accounted for a portion of the missing capital. There was another consistent drain on the corporate treasury that caught my analytical attention. I noticed a recurring automatic wire transfer scheduled for the first day of every single month. $50,000 was being pulled from the operational expense account and labeled as a vaguely defined marketing consultation fee. I traced the routing number associated with the receiving bank and discovered it belonged to a high-end real estate management firm based in southern Florida. I accessed public property records and cross-referenced the corporate tax identification numbers. The $50,000 monthly payment was not funding any marketing campaigns. It was covering the lease on an ultra-luxury penthouse condominium located in the most expensive district of Miami Beach. I dug deeper, pulling the digital copy of the residential lease agreement. The primary tenant listed on the binding legal document was not my sister Brittany. It was a 24-year-old woman with a background in amateur modeling who had absolutely zero employment history with the technology startup. Dion was using stolen venture capital to fund a secret lavish lifestyle for his hidden mistress, while simultaneously posing as the perfect devoted husband for my family. I sat back in my chair, the soft blue light of the 6 monitors illuminating the quiet office. I had successfully dismantled his entire false reality in less than 4 hours. The man my parents worshipped was a common thief hiding behind a custom-tailored suit and a confident smile. My sister was broadcasting her supposed superiority to the world from the deck of a rented yacht, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was actively draining their entire existence to fund his criminal exit strategy and his secret romantic affair. The hypocrisy was so dense it felt suffocating. They had mocked my quiet, reliable husband and praised a glamorous parasite. I took a deep, steadying breath, and turned my attention to the final remaining piece of the financial puzzle. Dion had recently secured a highly irregular $4 million bridge loan to keep the collapsing Ponzi scheme afloat for a few more weeks. A massive high-risk loan of that magnitude required substantial tangible collateral. I needed to know exactly what asset Dion had leveraged to convince a predatory lending institution to hand over $4 million in liquid cash. I opened the final encrypted directory containing the loan origination documents and scrolled down to the schedule of collateralized assets. I expected to find forged equipment manifests, or perhaps fraudulently inflated intellectual property valuations. Instead, my eyes locked onto a familiar address printed clearly in the center of the binding legal agreement. I blinked and read the property description a second time, ensuring my mind was not playing cruel tricks on me. It was the historic North Shore mansion. It was the sprawling, beautifully manicured estate where I had grown up. The same house where my parents hosted their extravagant holiday parties and paraded their wealth for their country club friends. The same house where I had been told my dreams of becoming an accountant were too boring to support. Richard and Caroline had secretly signed away the deed to their primary residence and their entire life savings to act as the sole guarantors for the $4 million loan. The magnitude of their absolute delusion washed over me. My parents had refused to co-sign a modest low-interest student loan when I wanted to pursue my forensic accounting degree, forcing me to work grueling night shifts to survive. They had denied me basic financial assistance when I purchased my first modest home, telling me that building character required personal sacrifice. Yet they had willingly, happily mortgaged their entire existence, their safe retirement, and the very roof over their heads to blindly fund a charismatic fraud. They had literally bet their entire lives on Dion, and they had lost everything. If the startup defaulted on the massive bridge loan, the predatory lending institution had the immediate legal right to seize the North Shore mansion and liquidate it. And because the startup was actually a hollow Ponzi scheme devoid of any real revenue, a catastrophic default was not just a possibility, it was an absolute mathematical certainty. I stared at the high-resolution screen, watching the cursor blink rhythmically next to the digital signature of my father. He had signed away his legacy for a man who was simultaneously stealing from him and betraying his favored daughter. The poetic justice of the situation was almost too perfect to comprehend. My family had worshipped the illusion of wealth so deeply that they had willingly sacrificed their actual security to maintain the facade. I felt a sudden, overwhelming rush of cold, hard clarity. They had abandoned me at the church altar to celebrate this criminal in Miami. They had laughed at my reliable husband and dismissed my career. Now the exact career they mocked had given me the power to control their ultimate destiny. I stood up from my multi-monitor workstation, my movements precise and deliberate. I gathered the printed summary pages, highlighting the fraudulent offshore transfers, the mistress lease agreement, and the catastrophic collateral documents involving the North Shore mansion. I walked back down the glass-walled corridor toward the master executive suite. The quiet hum of the Apex Capital trading floor felt like a low, steady heartbeat. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to the corner office without knocking. Harrison was still seated behind his massive reclaimed walnut desk, reviewing a separate portfolio. He looked up as I entered, his bright blue eyes, immediately reading the intense, absolute resolution written across my face. He set his pen down and folded his hands together, giving me his complete, undivided attention. I walked directly to his desk and dropped the stack of forensic evidence onto the polished wood. The papers landed with a satisfying, heavy thud. I did not need to offer a lengthy emotional explanation. We communicated in the shared language of undeniable data and financial reality. I looked down at the man who had stood by my side while my own blood relatives abandoned me. I thought about the empty velvet chairs in the church sanctuary and the arrogant social media posts from the rented yacht. I took a deep, steadying breath, pulling the cold, conditioned air deep into my lungs. "Freeze it all," I commanded, my voice steady and devoid of any hesitation or mercy. Harrison did not smile, but a dark, dangerous light ignited in his eyes. He understood exactly what those 3 words meant. It was the absolute point of no return. He reached across the desk and picked up the secure black telephone, dedicated exclusively to high-priority federal communications. He did not ask if I was sure or if I wanted to reconsider for the sake of family harmony. He simply executed the order with the ruthless efficiency that made him the most feared predator in the private equity sector. He dialed the direct private extension for the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission and simultaneously initiated the internal corporate protocols for an immediate hostile asset seizure. The massive invisible machinery of federal law enforcement and billionaire financial power roared to life. The trap I had meticulously uncovered was now violently snapping shut. My family was about to experience the devastating, brutal reality of the world they had so carelessly chosen over me. On the morning of the 20th day, the silence finally broke. Harrison and I were sitting in the small kitchen of our temporary apartment, bathed in the soft gray light of a crisp Chicago morning. We had leased this modest space for a few months while the extensive renovations on our permanent penthouse were being completed. The apartment was simple, featuring basic appliances and minimal furniture, a stark contrast to the immense financial power my husband wielded daily. I held a warm ceramic mug between my hands, inhaling the rich aroma of dark roast coffee, feeling a profound sense of peace. The previous 19 days had been an absolute masterclass in extreme patience and calculated restraint. I had watched my family flaunt their stolen wealth online, fully aware that the massive machinery of federal justice was quietly locking into place around them. We did not speak much that morning. There was no need for words. We simply sat together, enjoying the quiet sanctuary we had built, waiting for the inevitable culmination of the forensic audit I had executed. The sleek mobile device had been sitting completely face down on the wooden dining table, practically untouched since the day of our wedding. Suddenly, the phone vibrated against the hard surface with a violent jarring sound that shattered the morning tranquility. It was a harsh mechanical buzzing that demanded immediate attention. I did not reach for it right away. I simply watched it rattle against the polished wood. The vibration stopped for a fraction of a second, only to resume with even greater intensity. Harrison lowered his coffee mug and met my gaze, a knowing, quiet satisfaction settling in his bright blue eyes. The storm had finally made landfall on the coast of Miami. I reached across the table and picked up the phone, flipping it over to view the lock screen. The display was completely overwhelmed by a cascading waterfall of digital notifications. 10 missed calls appeared instantly. As I stared at the bright screen, the number updated to 50 missed calls. The notifications continued to multiply rapidly, blurring together in a frantic stream of panic. By the time the device finally stopped vibrating, the screen displayed exactly 129 missed calls. The vast majority of the calls originated from my mother Caroline, followed closely by frantic attempts from my father Richard and my sister Brittany. Alongside the missed calls were dozens of automated alerts indicating new voicemails. I tapped the screen to open the visual voicemail application, my thumb hovering over the first message recorded roughly 2 hours prior. I pressed play and engaged the speakerphone function so Harrison could listen to the unfolding catastrophe. The first message began with the familiar, arrogant tone my mother always used when she expected immediate compliance. She sounded mildly annoyed, demanding to know why I was ignoring her calls. She stated that Dion was experiencing a minor, frustrating banking error regarding his corporate accounts, and she wanted me to look into it, assuming my boring accounting job might finally be useful to the family. She ended the message by complaining about the poor cellular reception on their luxury yacht, completely oblivious to the brutal reality of her situation. I deleted the message and moved to the next recording, time-stamped 20 minutes later. The tone had shifted dramatically. The arrogant annoyance had vanished, replaced by a tight, breathless confusion. My mother's voice trembled as she explained that Dion's personal credit cards were suddenly declining. She described a humiliating scene at a high-end Miami boutique where Brittany's exorbitant purchases had been aggressively rejected by the cashiers. She demanded that I answer the phone immediately, insisting that the bank had made a catastrophic error that required my direct intervention. I could hear the rising tide of fear in her voice, the initial realization that the foundation of their glamorous lifestyle was beginning to crack. Harrison took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, his expression completely unreadable as we listened to the mounting desperation. I skipped ahead, bypassing several brief, frantic messages filled with heavy breathing and incomplete sentences, and selected a lengthy voicemail recorded just 30 minutes ago. This message was entirely different. The confusion had completely evaporated, replaced by raw, shrieking panic. The background noise of the recording was chaotic and loud. I could hear sirens wailing in the distance and men shouting authoritative commands. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, her voice pitching into a hysterical frequency that I had never heard before. She screamed into the receiver, describing a scene of absolute devastation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission had simultaneously raided the technology headquarters in Silicon Valley and boarded the luxury yacht in Miami. Federal agents had confiscated their personal electronic devices, seized the vessel, and frozen every single financial asset connected to Dion and his fraudulent enterprise. Through her frantic, hyperventilating sobs, my mother managed to articulate the specific detail that had sent her into a spiral of absolute terror. She screamed that the federal agents had presented them with official documentation regarding the immediate seizure of all assets. The documents explicitly stated that the freeze order was not solely a government initiative. The federal raid had been triggered and legally supported by the primary creditor of the technology startup. My mother shrieked the name of the private equity firm over and over again, begging me to pick up the phone. She sobbed that Apex Capital had completely dismantled the company overnight, locking them out of their accounts and stranding them in Florida without a single dollar to their names. She pleaded with me to answer, desperate for any lifeline, as her entire world collapsed into ruins. I ended the playback and set the phone back down on the table. The silence returned to our small kitchen, but it felt remarkably different now. It was the heavy, satisfying silence of absolute justice. I looked at Harrison, the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Capital, the man my family had dismissed as a meaningless failure. He simply smiled, stood up from the table, and walked to the kitchen sink to rinse his coffee mug, perfectly unfazed by the destruction he had rightfully orchestrated. A few hours passed in quiet anticipation. We knew they would not remain in Miami. Without access to their frozen bank accounts or their seized luxury transportation, they would be forced to scramble for survival. They likely had to beg distant acquaintances for emergency funds, just to secure basic commercial airline tickets back to Chicago. I spent the late morning organizing my work materials, preparing the physical documentation of the forensic audit for the inevitable confrontation. The modest temporary apartment felt exceptionally calm, an isolated fortress, insulated from the chaotic fallout of the federal raid. Harrison sat comfortably on the simple fabric sofa, reading a complex financial prospectus, waiting for the next phase of the operation to begin. He possessed an incredible capacity for patience, a trait that made him such a devastatingly effective force in the corporate world. The heavy silence of the early afternoon was suddenly shattered by a frantic, violent pounding at our front door. It was not a polite, socially acceptable knock. It was the desperate, erratic hammering of people who had completely lost their grip on reality. The loud thumping echoed through the small hallway of our apartment, followed immediately by the muffled, shrill sound of my mother shouting my name through the thick wooden door. I remained perfectly still for a moment, letting them expend their panicked energy. Harrison did not even look up from his financial reading. He simply turned a page, his posture remaining utterly relaxed, despite the aggressive invasion occurring just inches away. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my simple black trousers, and walked deliberately toward the entryway. I reached out, turned the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. My family spilled into the small entryway like a catastrophic wave of desperation. The sight of them was profoundly jarring. For my entire life, I had only known them as immaculately groomed, highly curated representations of extreme wealth. The people standing before me now were entirely unrecognizable. My mother, Caroline, looked absolutely feral. Her expensive designer resort wear was severely wrinkled, and dark streaks of mascara stained her cheeks from hours of continuous crying. My father Richard possessed a gray, sickly pallor. His usually confident posture collapsed into a hunched, defeated stance. Brittany, the golden child and lifestyle influencer, was completely hysterical, clutching a ruined designer handbag to her chest while taking short, ragged breaths. And Dion, the supposedly brilliant technology executive, looked utterly terrified, his eyes darting around the small space like a trapped animal searching for an impossible exit. They pushed their way past me, invading the modest living space without waiting for an invitation. Despite their absolute ruin, their ingrained sense of superiority and entitlement immediately flared to the surface. My mother stopped in the center of the room, her tear-stained eyes scanning the basic furnishings, the small kitchen area, and the lack of high-end artwork. Even in the midst of a federal investigation, she could not suppress her instinct to judge. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking her head as she looked at me. She declared that it made perfect sense that I lived in such a pathetic, depressing little box. She shouted that I was clearly miserable in this cheap apartment, and that my miserable existence was the exact reason I had refused to answer my phone while my family was suffering a legitimate crisis. She used the modesty of our temporary home as a weapon, trying to reclaim some small fraction of power by belittling my living conditions, completely ignorant of the fact that the man sitting quietly on the sofa owned half the commercial real estate in the surrounding district. The erratic shouting quickly escalated into a chaotic symphony of blame. Brittany collapsed into one of the simple dining chairs, sobbing loudly and demanding water, claiming that the stress of the commercial flight and the federal raid was going to cause a medical emergency. My father paced the small length of the living room, running his trembling hands through his thinning hair, muttering repeatedly about the country club and how their reputation was permanently destroyed. Dion remained near the doorway, sweating profusely, aggressively biting his fingernails as he muttered about legal representation and unconstitutional asset seizures. They were completely unhinged, trapped in a relentless cycle of denial and rage. They needed a scapegoat, someone to absorb the shock of their monumental failure, and they immediately turned their collective fury toward the easiest target in the room. My mother marched aggressively toward Harrison, who had finally set his reading material down on the coffee table. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at his face, her voice reaching a shrill, demanding pitch. She ordered him to stand up and listen to her. She screamed that she knew he worked for Apex Capital in some low-level capacity, and she demanded that he immediately contact his senior managers. She shrieked that Apex Capital had made a catastrophic, illegal mistake by freezing the corporate accounts, and she commanded Harrison to use his employment status to fix the situation immediately. She threatened to have him fired, claiming that Dion was a visionary genius and that the federal government was persecuting their family. She demanded that Harrison secure an emergency meeting with the executives at his firm, insisting that a simple phone call from a billionaire boss would clear up this entire ridiculous misunderstanding. They truly believed that their sheer entitlement could reverse a federal mandate, and they viewed my husband as nothing more than an insignificant tool to be used and discarded in their desperate bid for survival. The air in the small apartment suddenly grew impossibly thick, with the toxic, suffocating energy that my mother had weaponized for my entire life. Her face, previously twisted in a mask of panicked desperation, now contorted into an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. She could not comprehend the reality that her golden son-in-law was facing federal charges, and instead of accepting the undeniable truth of his massive financial fraud, she chose the path of least resistance. She chose to blame me. It was a reflex for her, a deeply ingrained habit cultivated over 3 decades of making me the designated scapegoat for every single family failure. With a sudden explosive burst of movement, she lunged across the narrow space separating the entryway from the living area. Her arms swung back in a wide, vicious arc, her manicured hand aiming a devastating slap directly at my face. I did not flinch, nor did I step backward. I simply stood my ground, fully prepared to absorb the physical blow, but the strike never connected. Harrison moved with a speed and precision that completely defied his relaxed, unassuming posture. Before my mother's hand could even cross the midpoint of its trajectory, his hand shot out like a steel vise. He caught her wrist effortlessly, his long fingers wrapping around her forearm with absolute immovable authority. The sudden halt of her momentum sent a shockwave through her body, causing her to stumble awkwardly in her expensive, ruined designer heels. Harrison did not twist her arm or employ any unnecessary aggression. He simply held her suspended in midair, an immovable barrier of calm, terrifying strength, protecting me from her violence. He looked down at her, his bright blue eyes, entirely devoid of emotion, and with a single smooth, controlled motion, he pushed her backward. The force was perfectly measured enough to send her stumbling back 2 full steps until she collided with my father, who had to grab her shoulders to keep her from falling onto the hardwood floor. The physical rejection sent my mother into a complete and utter frenzy. She shrieked, the sound tearing through the apartment, a chaotic blend of outrage and absolute delusion. She pointed her trembling finger at Harrison, her voice reaching a pitch that made the windows vibrate. She screamed that she knew perfectly well that he worked for Apex Capital. She bellowed that she had done her research, that she knew his boring, pathetic little corporate job paid his bills, and that his employer was the exact same firm that had just maliciously and illegally frozen Dion's massive technology empire. Her words tumbled out in a rapid, senseless stream of entitlement. She demanded that Harrison leave the apartment immediately, drive directly to his corporate headquarters, and beg his senior managers to reverse the asset freeze. She genuinely believed that a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm would simply undo a federal raid because a low-level employee asked them to all to save the fraudulent business of a man they considered to be a visionary genius. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was breathtaking to witness. She treated Harrison not as a human being, not as my husband, but as a completely disposable pawn whose only purpose in life was to serve the greater good of Dion and his fabricated success. She yelled that if Harrison refused to go to his bosses right this second, he would be personally responsible for the destruction of our family. She gestured wildly toward my sister Brittany, who was currently curled into a dramatic weeping ball on the dining chair. My mother screamed that Brittany was under so much stress from this completely unjustified persecution that she was going to literally miscarry her precious unborn child. She weaponized the pregnancy without a second thought, using the potential loss of a child as a blunt instrument of emotional blackmail to force my husband into compliance. She shouted that Dion was a brilliant African-American entrepreneur who was changing the world, and that Harrison was nothing but a jealous, insignificant nobody who was trying to sabotage a superior man out of pure spite. My father joined the chorus of absolute madness, stepping around my mother to point an accusing finger at Harrison. He demanded that Harrison show some respect for his betters, claiming that Dion had brought more honor and prestige to our family name in 2 years than Harrison could achieve in a lifetime of pushing papers at a financial firm. My father ordered Harrison to pick up his phone, call his direct supervisor, and arrange an emergency meeting with the board of directors at Apex Capital. He promised that he and Dion would personally attend this imaginary meeting, where they would graciously explain the situation to the executives and demand a formal public apology for the unauthorized freezing of the corporate accounts. The profound arrogance required to formulate such a demand was staggering. They were facing multiple counts of federal wire fraud. Their historic North Shore mansion was on the brink of catastrophic foreclosure, and yet they still firmly believed that they held the ultimate position of power in the room. Dion, emboldened by the aggressive defense mounted by my parents, finally found his voice. He stepped out from the shadows of the entryway, his custom-tailored linen suit looking rumpled and stained with sweat. He looked at Harrison with a mixture of fear and profound condescension. He arrogantly stated that Harrison had absolutely no idea how the real world of high-level venture capital operated. Dion claimed that the millions of dollars currently locked in offshore accounts were part of a highly complex, completely legal tax mitigation strategy that low-tier employees like Harrison could never possibly comprehend. He demanded that Harrison stop wasting time and immediately contact the legal department at Apex Capital, insisting that the firm would be facing a massive, unprecedented defamation lawsuit if the asset freeze was not lifted by the end of the business day. Dion stood there, a common criminal caught in a web of his own making, attempting to intimidate the very man who had designed the trap that held him. Brittany added to the chaotic symphony of entitlement, sobbing loudly into her hands, crying out that I was a monster for marrying a man who would participate in such a vicious, unprovoked attack against her perfect husband. She wailed that I had always been jealous of her beauty, her success, and her flawless marriage. She accused me of orchestrating this entire disaster because I could not bear to see her happy, claiming that I had manipulated Harrison into using his miserable little job to target Dion's magnificent company. They circled us like a pack of rabid, delusional wolves, screaming demands, hurling insults, and projecting their own massive failures onto us. They truly fundamentally believed that their status elevated them above the law and that Harrison was nothing more than an obedient servant who existed solely to correct the minor inconveniences in their otherwise flawless, luxurious lives. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical screaming. I did not attempt to defend Harrison's honor, nor did I try to inject logic into their completely fabricated delusional narrative. I simply turned my back on them. The profound disrespect of that simple movement seemed to infuriate my mother even further, her voice reaching a glass-shattering pitch as she continued to hurl demands and insults at the back of my head. I walked with slow, measured steps toward the small, open-concept kitchen area of our temporary apartment. My movements were deliberately relaxed, an intentional contrast to the frantic, chaotic energy bouncing off the walls. I reached into the upper cabinet, retrieved my favorite ceramic mug, and placed it under the brewing machine. I pressed the button, listening to the comforting mechanical hum of the coffee maker as it began to dispense the dark, steaming liquid. I took my time, adding a small splash of cream, stirring it slowly with a metal spoon, allowing the rhythmic clinking sound to serve as a steady metronome against the backdrop of their relentless screaming panic. I leaned back against the cool granite of the kitchen counter, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic mug, and simply watched them. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the rich, bitter flavor wash over my tongue. I allowed them to scream. I let my mother exhaust her vocabulary of insults, watching the veins bulge in her neck as she demanded Harrison's immediate compliance. I let my father threaten imaginary lawsuits and posture with a false authority he no longer possessed. I let Brittany sob until her throat was raw, her performative tears failing to elicit a single ounce of sympathy from me. I let Dion pace the floor, spewing arrogant financial jargon that meant absolutely nothing, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of a brilliant tech founder facing a minor bureaucratic hurdle. I watched them expend every last drop of their frenetic, terrified energy. I waited until their voices grew hoarse, until their aggressive posturing began to falter under the weight of my absolute unbroken silence. The screaming gradually began to subside, replaced by heavy, ragged breathing and confused, angry stares. They were waiting for a reaction, waiting for me to break down, apologize, or force Harrison to obey their ridiculous commands. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming thick and suffocating, amplifying the brutal reality of their situation. I took one final slow sip of my coffee, set the mug down on the granite counter with a soft thud, and looked directly into my mother's wide, bloodshot eyes. I did not smile, and I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, chilling precision of a forensic accountant presenting the final, irrefutable line of a devastating audit. "Harrison does not work for Apex Capital, Mom." I said the words cutting through the tense air like a scalpel. I paused for a fraction of a second, letting the initial statement sink into her frantic mind, watching her brow furrow in absolute confusion. "He owns it. He is the chief executive officer." The reaction was instantaneous and profoundly catastrophic. The entire family froze, paralyzed by a collective crushing wave of realization. It was as if the oxygen had been instantly vacuumed from the small apartment. My mother's mouth hung open in a silent, grotesque shape, her eyes darting wildly between my calm face and Harrison's relaxed, unbothered posture. She tried to speak to form a word of denial or protest, but her vocal cords simply refused to function. My father stumbled backward a half step, his hand reaching out to grip the back of the dining chair for physical support, the color draining completely from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very, very old. The arrogant, demanding patriarch, who had just threatened to sue a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm, was suddenly confronting the terrifying reality that he had just threatened the absolute ruler of that very empire. Brittany stopped crying mid-sob. Her perfectly manicured hands dropped slowly from her face, her tear-streaked eyes widening in absolute horror as she looked at the man she had just spent the last 20 minutes degrading and insulting. The realization that the boring, insignificant husband she had mocked for driving a battered Volvo and wearing plain suits was actually a billionaire titan of the financial industry short-circuited her mind. Her entire worldview, built exclusively on the shallow foundation of brand names, flashy cars, and performative wealth, violently collapsed in upon itself. She stared at Harrison as if he had suddenly transformed into a terrifying mythical creature, her mouth trembling as the devastating truth finally penetrated her thick layer of narcissistic delusion. But the most spectacular, satisfying reaction belonged entirely to Dayon. The charismatic, fast-talking Silicon Valley chief executive officer underwent a rapid, brutal physical transformation. The color drained from his face so quickly it was almost comical, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The confident, arrogant posture he had maintained just moments before completely shattered. His broad shoulders slumped forward, and a visible, uncontrollable tremor took hold of his hands. His eyes, wide and completely devoid of their usual charming sparkle, locked onto Harrison. In that singular, devastating moment, Dion realized the absolute magnitude of his fatal error. He realized that the unassuming man standing quietly in the center of the living room was not a disposable pawn, not a mid-level manager to be intimidated, and certainly not a victim to be manipulated. Dion realized that the boring guy in the Volvo was the apex predator of the corporate world. He was the billionaire financial executioner who had the absolute unchecked power to freeze his stolen assets, liquidate his fraudulent company, and completely destroy his entire existence with a single handwritten signature. Dayon stared at Harrison, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath into his panicked lungs. He looked at the man he had just arrogantly dismissed, the man he had brazenly insulted, and he finally understood the terrifying truth. Harrison held Dion's entire life, his freedom, his stolen wealth, and his future in the palm of his hand. And judging by the cold, merciless glint in Harrison's bright blue eyes, Dion knew with absolute certainty that he was not going to survive the encounter. The room remained trapped in that suffocating frozen silence, the heavy weight of their impending doom pressing down on them as the brutal reality of the power shift finally completely consumed them. The silence stretched thin, vibrating with the sheer weight of their collective shock. My mother's mouth opened and closed silently, her eyes wide as she tried to reconcile the image of her plain, boring daughter with the woman standing before her, commanding the attention of a billionaire and holding the fate of their entire existence in her hands. My father, who had spent my entire adult life dismissing my career as tedious and uninspired, now stared at me with a mixture of terror and awe. Brittany had stopped crying, her tears drying on her cheeks, as she looked from me to Harrison, and back again, her carefully constructed reality shattering into a million irreparable pieces. But Dion, the architect of this entire disaster, was the one who looked the most broken. He had built an empire on lies, charming his way into the pockets of investors and the hearts of my family, but he had never anticipated someone like me uncovering the truth. He had never expected the quiet, observant sister-in-law to be the one who dismantled his meticulously crafted illusion. I did not let them recover from the shock. I wanted them to feel the full force of their arrogance, the devastating consequences of their choices. I turned and walked toward the small modern bookshelf in the corner of our temporary apartment. My movements were slow and deliberate, matching the new rhythm of the power dynamic in the room. I reached behind a row of hardcover books and pulled out a thick, heavy document folder. The red cover was stark against the muted tones of our living space, a visual warning of the impending destruction it contained. I carried the folder back to the center of the room, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Every eye followed my movement, tracking the red folder with a kind of morbid fascination. I stopped in front of the glass coffee table, looking down at Dion, whose face had drained of all color. I lifted the folder high above the table and let it drop. The heavy thud echoed through the silent apartment, a sound that felt final and absolute. The 500-page forensic audit file rested on the glass surface, a physical manifestation of Dion's criminal activity. I looked at the man who had stolen my parents' future, the man who had funded a secret life with their money, and I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. "And Harrison was not the one who audited your company, Dion," I said, my voice cutting through the thick, tense air. The silence in the room deepened, anticipation building as they waited for the next blow. I paused, letting the statement hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the final devastating truth. I did. I am the lead forensic investigator for Apex Capital. I am the one who spent the last 20 days meticulously tracking every single dollar you stole. I am the one who signed the freeze order, and I am the one who sent your files to the Federal Bureau of Investigation this morning. My mother gasped, a sharp, choked sound that betrayed her complete lack of understanding. "Cassidy, what are you saying?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "You are just an accountant. You do taxes and spreadsheets. You do not have the power to do something like this." I turned my gaze toward her, my expression devoid of any sympathy. "That is exactly what you have always thought of me, Mom," I replied, the years of suppressed anger finally bleeding into my tone. "You thought my career was a joke, a tedious little hobby that kept me busy while the rest of you chased real success. But you were wrong. I am not just an accountant. I am a forensic investigator trained to find the hidden rot inside corporate structures. And your golden son-in-law left a massive, glaring trail of evidence right to his doorstep." I pointed a finger at the red folder resting on the coffee table. "That file contains everything, Dion," I said, turning my attention back to him. "The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the fabricated investor dividends, the hollow shell companies you used to launder the stolen capital. I found it all." Dion swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the door as if contemplating an impossible escape. "You have no idea what you are talking about," he managed to say, his voice shaking. "Those are legitimate business expenses. You are misinterpreting complex financial strategies." I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed in the small apartment. "Legitimate business expenses?" I challenged, stepping closer to him. "Is that what you call the $50,000 monthly wire transfer to the luxury penthouse in Miami Beach? The one leased under the name of your 24-year-old mistress?" The room exploded. Brittany shrieked, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the tense atmosphere. She lunged at Dion, her perfectly manicured hands clawing at his custom-tailored linen suit. "A mistress!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "You have a mistress! You told me those trips to Miami were for investor meetings!" Dion stumbled backward, trying to defend himself against her attack. "Brittany, please, it is a lie. She is making it up," he yelled, his voice rising in panic. But the damage was done. The facade had cracked, and the ugly, undeniable truth was pouring out. My parents rushed forward, pulling Brittany away from Dion, their faces pale with shock and outrage. My father turned to me, his eyes wide. "Cassidy, is this true?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" I did not flinch under his desperate gaze. "I have the lease agreement, Dad," I said calmly. "I have the wire transfer records, the bank statements, the entire financial history of his secret life. It is all in that folder." I looked at Dion, who was now leaning against the wall, breathing heavily, a cornered animal, realizing there was no way out. "You thought you were so much smarter than everyone else?" I told him, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "You thought you could use my family, steal their money, and live a double life without any consequences. But you made one fatal mistake, Dion. You underestimated me. You assumed I was just a boring accountant, an insignificant obstacle in your path to wealth and status. But I am the one who tore down your empire, and I did it without breaking a single law. You are going to federal prison, and you are going to spend the rest of your life knowing that you were outsmarted by the sister-in-law you thought was a joke. The absolute finality of my statement hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the predictable explosion occurred. When a pathological narcissist is entirely cornered and stripped of their carefully constructed illusions, they do not surrender or apologize. They attack with a desperate feral intensity. Dion pushed himself away from the wall, his chest heaving as he frantically tried to reclaim the narrative that was rapidly disintegrating around him. The charming, sophisticated technology executive vanished, completely replaced by a cornered animal lashing out with the only weapons he had left. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, his voice rising to a booming theatrical volume designed to intimidate and dominate the physical space of our modest apartment. He shouted that this entire investigation was a racially motivated witch hunt. He screamed that I could not stand the sight of a highly successful, wealthy black man thriving in a corporate world dominated by people who looked like Harrison. He paced aggressively across the hardwood floor, weaving a complex fabricated story about systemic oppression and corporate sabotage, claiming that Apex Capital was simply trying to steal his revolutionary intellectual property by burying him under mountains of manufactured legal paperwork. Dion looked toward my parents, desperately trying to rally his most loyal audience. He bellowed that I was nothing more than a deeply jealous, vindictive woman who had spent her entire life seething with envy over the magnificent lifestyle he provided for his beautiful wife. He insisted that the offshore accounts were perfectly legal tax shelters recommended by elite financial advisors, and that the federal raid was an unconstitutional overreach orchestrated by my vindictive manipulation. It was a spectacular performance of absolute delusion. He threw around words like defamation prejudice and corporate espionage, hoping that by simply speaking loudly enough, he could bend reality back to his will. He demanded that my father intervene, insisting that Richard use his remaining country club connections to contact politicians and halt the federal investigation. My father simply stared at him, paralyzed by the overwhelming magnitude of the financial catastrophe unfolding before his eyes. Sensing that her husband was losing his grip on the room, Brittany decided to join the offensive. She pushed herself up from the dining chair, her designer dress wrinkled and stained with her own hysterical tears. The mask of the polished, sophisticated lifestyle influencer shattered completely, revealing the vicious, spoiled child she had always been beneath the surface. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing painfully off the walls of the apartment. She accused me of being a bitter, ugly sister who had spent 3 decades plotting to destroy her perfect, flawless family out of pure, unadulterated spite. She screamed that I had always been the hideous, awkward disappointment of the family, and that I could never organically attract a successful man on my own merit. According to Brittany, my entire marriage to Harrison was nothing more than a calculated transactional sham. She wailed that I had intentionally sought out a ruthless billionaire predator solely to use his vast financial resources to crush her happiness. She pointed at my plain clothes and my sensible shoes, screaming that I would always be the boring, miserable accountant, no matter how much money my husband possessed. She sobbed that I was deliberately trying to induce a miscarriage by subjecting her to this unbelievable stress, and that if anything happened to her precious unborn baby, the blood would be permanently on my hands. She looked at my mother, expecting the usual immediate defense, expecting Caroline to rush forward and scold me for upsetting the golden child. But my mother remained rooted to her spot, her eyes wide with a terrifying, dawning comprehension. The realization that she had mortgaged her historic mansion to fund the man currently having a mental breakdown in my living room had finally paralyzed her maternal instincts. The chaotic symphony of their desperate gaslighting washed over me without leaving a single mark. In the past, their combined verbal assaults would have caused me to shrink into myself, to question my own sanity, and to apologize simply to restore the peace. But the woman who used to cower before their cruelty no longer existed. My forensic accounting background had trained me to detach completely from emotional manipulation and focus exclusively on the raw, undeniable data. I watched Dion sweat through his expensive linen suit. I watched Brittany smear her high-end cosmetics across her flushed face. I observed their frantic, erratic movements not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a highly predictable chemical reaction. Their words were nothing more than empty sound waves desperately crashing against an impenetrable fortress of verified evidence. I glanced at Harrison, who was leaning casually against the kitchen counter, his arms folded across his chest. He was watching the chaotic display with a look of mild anthropological interest, completely unbothered by the insults being hurled in his direction. He did not feel the need to defend his character or our marriage against the frantic ravings of a sinking fraudster. He simply waited, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable power. His calm presence anchored me, allowing me to let them expend the very last reserves of their aggressive energy. They shouted until their voices grew hoarse, until the veins in Dion's neck bulged against his collar, and until Brittany was reduced to pathetic hiccuping gasps. They threw every single toxic weapon they had at me, hoping to strike a nerve, hoping to find a vulnerability they could exploit to regain the upper hand. But there were no vulnerabilities left to exploit. I stood perfectly still, my posture relaxed, my breathing slow and measured. I let the oppressive silence slowly creep back into the room as they finally ran out of breath. The air felt thick and heavy, loaded with the undeniable reality that their aggressive intimidation tactics had completely failed. They looked at me panting and disheveled, expecting me to argue back to defend myself against their vicious character assassinations. They wanted a screaming match because chaos was the only environment where their manipulation could survive. I refused to give them that satisfaction. I would not lower myself to their level of emotional savagery. I was not going to debate the merits of my marriage, the quality of my physical appearance, or the validity of my professional expertise. I was simply going to continue the meticulous, systematic destruction of their fabricated reality, one irrefutable piece of evidence at a time. The gaslighter last desperate stand had concluded, leaving them breathless, humiliated, and entirely out of options. They had played every card in their toxic deck, and it had yielded absolutely nothing but the hollow echo of their own desperation. I stood firm, ready to transition from observing their pathetic meltdown to delivering the fatal, unarguable blow that would permanently sever their connection to my world. I did not raise my voice to counter their hysterical accusations. I did not shed a single tear in response to my sister calling me a bitter, ugly disappointment. I simply turned away from their frantic, sweaty faces and walked calmly toward the sleek black television mounted on the wall of our temporary living room. I reached into the pocket of my trousers and retrieved my small silver remote control alongside my digital tablet. The living room remained cloaked in a tense, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of Brittany taking sharp, ragged breaths and Dion shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. I pressed the power button on the remote, and the large screen flared to life, illuminating the room with a crisp, bright light. With a few swift, practiced motions on my touchscreen, I cast my tablet display directly onto the high-definition television monitor. I was done speaking in abstract terms. It was time for the visual presentation of their absolute destruction. The first slide of my presentation appeared on the screen, towering over them in stark, undeniable clarity. I looked directly at my sister, whose tear-streaked face was now illuminated by the glow of the television. "Your spectacular gender reveal party in Miami." I began, my voice ringing with a cold, clinical precision that left absolutely no room for debate or interpretation. "You told the entire world that Dion organized that lavish weekend simply to celebrate the upcoming birth of your child. You posted endless videos of the custom floral arrangements, the expensive catered food, and the private yacht rental, claiming it was the ultimate display of a devoted husband celebrating his growing family. You mocked my simple wedding from across the country, boasting that real families support massive successes. I paused, letting the weight of her previous arrogance settle heavily into the room. I tapped the screen of my tablet, advancing to the next piece of evidence. Dion did not fly you down to Florida to celebrate a baby, Brittany. I stated the truth, cutting through the air like a sharpened blade. He flew you down there to establish a convenient, highly publicized social cover story while he secretly met with top-tier bankruptcy lawyers. The screen shifted to display a highly detailed calendar synchronized with private aviation flight logs and geolocation data extracted from Dion corporate cellular device. I highlighted a specific series of timestamps using a bright digital marker. While you were busy posting curated photographs of your mocktail by the resort swimming pool, Dion was sitting in a secure conference room at a prominent Miami law firm that specializes in catastrophic corporate liquidation and offshore asset protection. I pulled up the billing invoices from the legal firm, clearly showing massive retainer fees paid directly from the rapidly dwindling technology startup accounts. My parents stared at the television screen, their mouths hanging slightly open as they read the damning documents. The undeniable proof of Dion's premeditated deceit was right in front of them, verified by dates, times, and authorized signatures. But the bankruptcy consultation was merely the preliminary phase of his grand design. I continued, my voice remaining perfectly level as I navigated to the next slide. I brought up a complex map detailing international flight paths and global banking regulations. Dion knew the federal authorities were closing in. He knew the massive bridge loan secured by Mom and Dad's historic North Shore mansion was nothing more than a temporary bandage on a fatal financial wound. He was entirely out of time, and he was out of other people's money to steal. The gender reveal party was his final extravagant performance before he initiated his escape protocol. The screen displayed a series of flagged email communications between Dion and an international travel broker. I highlighted the destination routing. He was finalizing the purchase of a one-way private charter flight departing from Miami and landing in a very specific jurisdiction in South America. I turned my gaze toward Dion, who was now staring at the floor, completely unable to meet the eyes of the family he had so ruthlessly exploited. For those of you who are unfamiliar with international criminal law, I explained, my tone resembling a professor delivering a lecture to a classroom of particularly slow students. The country Dion selected for his immediate relocation happens to be a non-extradition jurisdiction. This means that once he landed on their soil, the United States federal government would have absolutely no legal authority to force his return to face prosecution for wire fraud, money laundering, and the theft of investor capital. He was going to vanish into the tropical sun with millions of dollars in stolen funds, leaving all of you behind to face the catastrophic consequences of his actions. I looked at my mother, whose hands were trembling uncontrollably as she stared at the flight manifests. He was not planning to take you with him, Brittany, I said, delivering the final devastating blow to my sister's carefully constructed reality. There was only one passenger listed on the charter flight manifest. He was going to abandon you, pregnant and completely broke, in a Miami hotel room while the federal agents kicked down the doors of his empty California headquarters. He was going to leave Mom and Dad to deal with the immediate foreclosure of their beloved mansion. The man you chose over me, the man you abandoned my wedding to support the man you believed was a visionary genius, was actively planning to leave you holding the bag for his massive multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. The absolute truth of the situation finally crashed down upon them, extinguishing the last lingering sparks of their delusion. There were no more excuses to be made, no more racist victimization narratives to spin, no more gaslighting attempts to deploy. The hard, undeniable evidence was projected on a 55-inch screen in high definition, exposing the staggering depth of his betrayal. Brittany let out a low, agonizing wail, completely collapsing into the arms of my father, who looked like he was about to physically vomit. Dion remained completely silent, his previous arrogance entirely erased by the overwhelming weight of his exposure. I stood before the television, my digital tablet in hand, feeling a profound sense of closure. I had not needed to yell or scream or resort to petty name-calling. I had simply turned on the lights and allowed the cockroaches to scramble in the sudden blinding glare of the absolute truth. The room felt entirely different now, stripped of all the pretentious energy that had previously fueled their attacks. I watched my mother slowly sink onto the edge of the sofa, her hands covering her face, as she finally grasped the horrific reality that her insatiable greed for social status had directly orchestrated the complete destruction of her own life. She had traded her loyal daughter for a charming criminal, and the receipt for that transaction was now being displayed in undeniable, high-contrast digital format. I powered down the television screen, the sudden blackness serving as the perfect punctuation mark to the end of their glamorous, fabricated existence. The evidence had been presented, the verdict was clear, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to run. But I was definitely not finished quite yet. The black screen reflected their pale faces for only a moment before I pressed the remote control again. The television flared to life, illuminating the room with fresh financial documents. I turned my attention to my parents, who were huddled together on the sofa, looking as though they had aged a decade. "Dad, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. "I want you to look closely at the dates and routing numbers on this next slide. Do you remember that $800,000 you wired to Dion last month? The emergency funding he desperately needed to scale the server infrastructure." My father swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the screen. He nodded slowly, his hands trembling. "Yes," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "We liquidated our remaining stock portfolios to give him that money. He said the company would collapse without the upgrades." "The company was already collapsing," I corrected him, pointing at the highlighted records. "But that specific $800,000 did not go toward saving the business. It did not buy computer hardware or pay a single software engineer." I swiped my tablet, bringing up high-resolution photographs alongside the bank statements. The images showed a breathtaking penthouse apartment featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, a wraparound balcony, and a panoramic ocean view. The modern furniture practically screamed exorbitant wealth. "He used your entire life savings to secure a luxury penthouse in South Beach," I stated, letting the reality settle over them. "But the property deed is not in his name, and it is not in Brittany's name." I brought up a copy of the residential lease. I magnified the signature line so the bold ink was visible to everyone. The penthouse was leased under the name of a 24-year-old aspiring model, I explained, maintaining my cold delivery. "She has no employment history with the startup, no background in software development, and no legitimate reason to receive hundreds of thousands of dollars. Dion has been funding her extravagant lifestyle using the exact money you sacrificed your retirement to provide." Brittany let out a choked, gasping sound, her hands flying to her mouth. She stared at the photographs of the luxury apartment, her eyes wide with a sickening mixture of shock and profound humiliation. "No," Brittany whimpered, shaking her head back and forth, as if the physical motion could somehow erase the undeniable evidence projected in front of her. "Dion, tell her she is lying. Tell them this is a mistake." Dion remained completely silent, his eyes glued to the floor, sweat beading on his forehead. He had absolutely nothing left to say. His charming excuses and aggressive gaslighting tactics were entirely useless against the hard, verified financial data. "If the bank records are not convincing enough," I continued, "perhaps you would prefer to hear it directly from him." I tapped an audio file embedded in the presentation slide. During my forensic audit, I gained access to the unencrypted communication logs from his supposedly secure corporate cellular device. "This is a voicemail he left for his South Beach mistress exactly 3 days ago, right before you all flew down to Miami for your ridiculous fabricated party." I pressed play, and the unmistakable smooth voice of my brother-in-law filled the silent apartment. "Baby, it is me." Dion's recorded voice echoed from the television speakers, dripping with a sickening, intimate affection that made my skin crawl. "I am finalizing the offshore transfers right now. I just have to endure one last miserable weekend playing the devoted family man. I promise you I am leaving my annoying high-maintenance wife very soon. She is completely clueless, just like her pathetic parents. Have the champagne ready. I will be home with you by Tuesday, and we will never have to look back." The audio clip ended, leaving a crushing, absolute silence in its wake. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of his recorded words hung in the air, stripping away the very last illusion of their perfect family dynamic. Brittany's knees buckled. The pristine, sophisticated influencer facade she had meticulously maintained for her entire adult life completely shattered in a single devastating instant. She collapsed heavily onto the hardwood floor, the fabric of her expensive designer dress bunching up around her as she fell. She did not scream or throw a tantrum this time. Instead, she curled into a tight, trembling ball, letting out deep, agonizing wails of pure, unfiltered heartbreak. The reality of her husband's absolute betrayal had finally broken her. My parents rushed to her side, falling to their knees on the floor, their hands hovering helplessly over their sobbing, devastated golden child. They were all entirely broken, utterly humiliated, and completely ruined forever now. I stood perfectly still in the center of our living room, looking down at the absolute wreckage of my entire family. The large television screen behind me finally clicked off and slowly reverted to a completely blank black display. Brittany remained crumpled on the cold hardwood floor, and her hysterical sobs echoed through the quiet apartment like the desperate cries of a wounded animal. Richard knelt beside her, staring blankly into the distance, as his financial annihilation washed over him. He had spent decades building a prestigious reputation, cultivating an image of generational wealth and untouchable status. Now he faced a catastrophic federal investigation and the loss of his mansion. Dayon pressed his back against the wall, desperate to disappear. His suit was soaked with sweat and his breathing came in frantic gasps. He knew federal agents were likely already drafting his arrest warrants. But the most fascinating and horrifying transformation belonged entirely to my mother Caroline. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flash of genuine maternal devastation cross her face. I thought she might finally gather her broken daughter into her arms and apologize for this disastrous alliance. But a pathological narcissist does not experience genuine remorse when backed into a corner. Their brains are wired for absolute survival at the expense of everyone else. I watched the gears turning behind her wide, tear-filled eyes. I watched her process the undeniable reality that Dion was no longer her golden ticket to high society. He was a sinking ship, and Caroline was not the type of woman to drown with the captain. She needed a new life raft, and she needed it immediately. Slowly, she released her grip on Brittany's shoulder and stood up from the floor. She smoothed the wrinkles out of her resort wear, her face hardening into calculated determination. She stepped over her weeping daughter without a second glance, completely abandoning the child she had favored for 30 years. Caroline marched across the living room, closing the distance between us. With a sudden frantic energy, she stopped directly in front of me, and before I could step back, she reached out and aggressively grabbed both of my hands. Her fingers dug into my skin with a painful, desperate grip. I tried to pull away, but her hold was fueled by absolute panic. "Cassidy," she gasped, her voice trembling with a terrifying blend of manufactured affection and aggressive demand. "You were right about him. You were right about everything from the very beginning." She looked back over her shoulder at Dayon, shooting him a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "Okay, Dion is a monster," she declared, her voice rising so everyone in the room could hear her sudden shift in allegiance. "He is a disgusting, lying criminal who manipulated all of us and destroyed your sister life. He deserves to rot in a federal prison for what he did to our family." She turned her attention back to me, her eyes wide and pleading but devoid of contrition. "But Cassidy, you have to listen to me," she continued, dropping her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "You and Harrison are billionaires. You own Apex Capital. You have more money than we could ever possibly comprehend, and you have the power to fix this entire nightmare with a single phone call." I stared at her, completely repulsed by her breathtaking audacity. She had not offered a single word of apology for abandoning me at the church altar. She had not expressed an ounce of regret for the emotional abuse she had inflicted upon me. She was pivoting her parasitic attachment directly onto the daughter she had discarded. "You have to bail us out," she demanded, her grip tightening on my hands until my knuckles turned white. "The bank is going to take the North Shore mansion because we co-signed his loans. Your father and I will be out on the street with absolutely nothing. We will lose our memberships, our social standing, our entire legacy in this city. You cannot just stand there and let that happen to your own flesh and blood. I finally managed to wrench my hands free from her desperate grasp, taking a deliberate step backward to put physical space between us. Mom, I said, my voice dangerously calm, you mortgaged your own home to fund a criminal enterprise because you wanted to show off to your country club friends. That was your decision. Why should Harrison and I pay for your blinding greed? Because you owe us for raising you, Cassidy, my mother shrieked, throwing all pretense of maternal affection out the window and resorting to her most fundamental toxic weapon. I gave you a roof over your head. I fed you and clothed you and made sure you went to good schools. You would not even have that fancy accounting degree if it were not for the comfortable life we provided for you. Family protects family. That is what we do when things go wrong. She gestured wildly toward Harrison, who was watching the exchange with a look of absolute cold disgust. Tell your husband to use his massive wealth to pay off the $4 million bridge loan right now, she ordered, her voice echoing off the walls of the modest apartment. It is basically pocket change to a man in his position. He can wipe away the debt, save our family home, and we can put this entire ugly misunderstanding behind us. We can welcome him into the family with open arms and start fresh. We can be the happy, successful family we were always meant to be. She truly believed that she could simply demand $4 million as compensation for fulfilling her basic legal obligation to provide food and shelter to her own child. She believed she could erase decades of cruelty by offering Harrison an insincere invitation into her social circle. She saw absolutely no issue demanding we rescue her from her own vanity. I stared at the woman who brought me into this world, listening to her absurd demands echo through the small apartment. She stood there expecting me to simply erase a catastrophic $4 million mistake because we shared the same genetic makeup. Her definition of family was nothing more than a convenient financial safety net that she could activate whenever her own massive ego caused a disastrous failure. I looked at her manicured hands and the desperate panic in her eyes, feeling absolutely no obligation to save her. The sheer audacity of her request was both repulsive and entirely predictable. She honestly believed that providing me with basic shelter and food during my childhood was a transactional debt that I was now legally required to repay with the private wealth my husband possessed. She thought that because she birthed me, she held a permanent claim on my future, my success, and my bank accounts. I turned my back on her frantic pleading and walked slowly toward the small wooden console table situated near the entryway. My movements were deliberately calm and completely unhurried, a stark contrast to the frantic energy vibrating from my parents and my deeply humiliated younger sister. I opened the top drawer of the wooden console table and retrieved my personal leather-bound checkbook. The satisfying sound of the heavy drawer sliding shut caused a sudden hush to fall over the living room. For a fleeting second, my mother probably believed that her emotional manipulation had actually worked. She probably thought I was reaching for my pen to write a check that would miraculously clear their massive bridge loan and save their beloved mansion from the impending federal foreclosure. I could practically feel her holding her breath as I slowly turned around, holding the dark leather checkbook. I retrieved a black ink pen from the table and slowly uncapped it. I walked back toward the center of the living room, stopping just a few feet away from where my mother stood. I did not look at Harrison for permission because I did not need it. This was my money earned through years of grueling forensic accounting work, completely separate from his billion-dollar private equity firm. I held the checkbook steady in my left hand and pressed the tip of the pen against the crisp paper. The room was so quiet I could hear myself breathe now. I wrote the current date at the top of the check. Then I moved to the payee line and carefully printed the full legal name my mother used. My father stepped forward slightly, his eyes widening with a sudden, desperate spark of hope. Even Dayon, who was still pressing himself against the far wall, leaned in to watch the transaction unfold. They were all completely mesmerized by the simple piece of paper, expecting it to be their ultimate salvation. I moved my pen to the numerical box and wrote a 1 followed by 4 zeros, adding a bold decimal point. I wrote out the amount in clear block letters to ensure there was absolutely no misunderstanding regarding the sum. $10,000.00. I signed my name at the bottom of the check with a fluid, practiced motion completing the financial instrument. I tore the small rectangular slip of paper from the leather binding, listening to the sharp ripping sound tear through the heavy silence of the apartment. I held the check between my index and middle fingers, letting it flutter slightly in the ambient air currents of the room. My mother stared at the paper, waiting silently. Her eyes darted from the check to my face, her brow furrowing in profound confusion as her brain struggled to process the mathematical reality. $10,000 was a significant amount of money, but it was nowhere near the $4 million required to stop the bank from seizing her historic estate. I stepped forward and deliberately released the check from my fingers. The small piece of paper drifted slowly downward, cutting through the tense atmosphere, before landing softly on the hardwood floor, directly at her feet. She stared down at it, completely paralyzed by the deeply insulting financial gesture. "When I was 18, you kicked me out with nothing because I wanted to be an accountant instead of a doctor," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, chilling clarity. "I paid 12% interest on my student loans while working night shifts. The exact amount you gave me my entire adult life was zero. Meanwhile, you bought Dion a Porsche. This $10,000 is to cover your moving truck. I owe you nothing." The harsh words struck her like a physical blow, causing her to stumble backward and cover her mouth in pure, unadulterated shock and absolute horror. The devastating finality of my statement shattered the remaining fragments of her delusion. She looked down at the $10,000 check resting on the floor, realizing it was not a lifeline, but a highly calculated insult designed to highlight her absolute failure. It was the exact estimated cost to hire a professional moving company to pack up the remnants of her shattered life and transport them to whatever cheap suburban rental property she would be forced to inhabit. I was explicitly telling her to pack her bags. My father let out a quiet, agonized groan of pure, devastating defeat. He finally understood that the daughter he had neglected and mocked for decades was the only person capable of saving him, and she had just firmly slammed the door permanently shut. Brittany began to sob again, burying her face in her hands, as the reality of their complete financial annihilation washed over her. Dion remained pinned against the wall, a silent, pathetic witness to the destruction he had caused. I stood tall, looking at the shattered remains of the people who had abandoned me at the altar. I had severed the toxic chains, and I was finally completely, totally free. The profound silence did not last long. Our temporary apartment was suddenly pierced by a rhythmic, pulsing light filtering through the large front windows. The harsh illumination bounced off the walls, painting the space in rapid, alternating flashes of bright crimson and deep sapphire blue. The strobe effect cast distorted shadows across the faces of my family members, distracting them from the $10,000 check resting on the floor. My father turned toward the glass panes, his brow furrowed in confusion, as the wail of approaching sirens grew exponentially louder. The deafening noise cut through the Chicago evening, signaling an arrival that had been meticulously coordinated. The piercing sound reverberated through the street, announcing a presence that could not be ignored, bribed, or manipulated. My mother stepped away from the window, her previous aggressive posturing entirely forgotten as a new visceral fear took root in her chest. Harrison remained leaning against the kitchen counter, completely undisturbed by the flashing lights and blaring sirens. He smoothly lifted his left arm, pulling back the cuff of his plain navy suit jacket to reveal a simple timepiece. He studied the dial for a fraction of a second before letting his arm drop to his side. He looked across the room at the panicked assembly of my relatives and offered a tight, highly satisfied smile. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation is remarkably punctual," he noted, his voice possessing a calm, conversational tone that sharply contrasted with the escalating panic outside. His words fell into the room like heavy stones, solidifying the absolute reality of the nightmare arriving at our doorstep. The casualness of his observation sent a visible shockwave through the room. They assumed my forensic audit was merely a private threat, an internal family dispute over stolen funds, but Harrison just confirmed that the highest echelons of federal law enforcement were currently surrounding our building. The sound of heavy tactical boots thundering down the hallway outside our apartment echoed like a relentless drumbeat. The rapid, aggressive footsteps grew closer, multiplying in volume as multiple individuals approached our unit. Dion stumbled backward, his expensive linen suit appearing far too large for his shrinking frame. His eyes darted wildly around the modest living space, desperately calculating the physical layout of the room. The confident technology executive was gone, replaced by a cornered, desperate fugitive, facing the catastrophic end of his criminal empire. A sharp, authoritative knock struck the doorframe, immediately followed by the overwhelming presence of federal agents swarming into the entryway. They wore dark tactical vests emblazoned with bold yellow letters, their expressions hardened and strictly professional. The lead agent stepped forward, his gaze instantly locking onto Dion. Dion did not attempt to negotiate or offer an excuse. Driven by pure primal panic, he spun around and bolted toward the back of the apartment. He scrambled past the dining table, knocking over a chair in his frantic, desperate bid to reach the rear exit door leading to the fire escape. He sprinted with the reckless energy of a man who knew his entire life was completely over. But his attempt to flee was entirely futile. The federal agents moved with terrifying speed and coordinated precision. Two officers surged past my screaming mother and intercepted Dion just before his hand could grasp the metal doorknob. They tackled him forcefully, driving his shoulder into the drywall with a loud, resounding crash. The impact rattled the framed artwork hanging nearby. Dion let out a sharp gasp as the agent swiftly pinned his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed through the apartment, sealing his fate. The lead agent stood over the subdued executive and retrieved a document from his pocket. He projected a commanding voice that easily overpowered the chaotic noise in the room. He informed Dion that he was being placed under immediate federal arrest. The agent rapidly listed the catastrophic charges, reading them aloud for the entire family to hear. Dion was being detained for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, systemic money laundering, and the illicit embezzlement of private investor capital. The federal officer explicitly mentioned the diversion of funds to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, validating every single finding from my meticulous forensic audit. The public recitation of his numerous financial crimes stripped away the very last lingering shred of his fabricated visionary persona, leaving nothing but a common desperate thief pinned against the hallway wall. Brittany collapsed into a state of absolute unhinged hysteria. She scrambled across the floor, crawling toward the hallway where her husband was being restrained by federal agents. Her perfectly styled hair clung to her wet face in tangled strands. She reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab onto the sleeve of Dion's ruined linen suit. She screamed his name over and over again, her voice tearing and breaking under the immense crushing weight of her complete humiliation. She begged him to speak, to tell her that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, a cruel, vindictive setup orchestrated by her jealous sister. She sobbed uncontrollably, pleading with the federal agents to release him, insisting that her husband was a brilliant, innocent entrepreneur who was being unfairly persecuted. Dion never looked at her. He kept his eyes squeezed tightly shut, his jaw clenched in silent, agonizing defeat as the agents hauled him roughly to his feet. He had absolutely no comforting lies left to offer her. The agents guided him firmly toward the front door, maneuvering him past my horrified, paralyzed parents. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, watching her golden son-in-law being dragged away in heavy steel chains. Brittany remained sobbing on the floor, her hands clutching the empty air as the agents escorted Dion out of the apartment and down the long hallway toward the waiting flashing lights. The heavy front door swung shut behind them, leaving my shattered family to face the devastating permanent reality of their absolute total destruction. The heavy front door clicked shut, sealing the apartment and leaving a suffocating vacuum in its wake. The flashing red and blue lights outside gradually faded as the federal vehicles pulled away, taking the architect of my family ruin with them into the night. Inside our temporary apartment, the silence was absolute and entirely unbroken save for the ragged breathing of my younger sister. Brittany remained curled on the hardwood floor. Her expensive dress ruined her entire identity, completely erased in a matter of minutes. My mother, Caroline, stood frozen near the kitchen island, staring blankly at the space where her golden son-in-law had just been wrestled into steel handcuffs. The grandiose illusion she had spent decades cultivating had all been dismantled and carried out the door by federal agents. The reality of their catastrophic failure hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. But it was my father, Richard, who finally broke the profound silence. With Dion gone and the massive federal fraud exposed, the reality of that $4 million bridge loan finally crushed the last remaining breath of his arrogance. His shoulders slumped and a violent, uncontrollable tremor overtook his hands. He slowly turned his gaze away from the empty hallway and looked directly at Harrison. The contempt he had always held for my husband was completely gone, replaced by a raw, naked desperation that was almost pitiful to witness. He took a hesitant, trembling step forward, his eyes wide and pleading. He raised his shaking hands, a gesture of absolute submission to the man he had once mocked for driving a modest car and wearing plain suits. "Harrison," my father began, his voice cracking and weak, completely stripped of its usual booming authority. "Please, you have to help us. The house, the estate, it is everything we have left. We signed those papers because we thought he was building a legitimate company. We did not know he was stealing." He paused, swallowing hard, fighting back the tears of a completely broken man. "You own Apex Capital. You have billions of dollars at your disposal. This loan is nothing to a firm like yours. Please, cannot Apex Capital just forgive the debt? Cannot you just wipe the slate completely clean for family? We will do anything you ask. Just please do not let them take our home." He was begging. The proud, untouchable patriarch of our family was literally begging my husband for financial mercy, but I was not about to let Harrison bear the weight of their pathetic desperation. This was my moment of absolute closure. I stepped forward smoothly, positioning myself directly between my father and my husband, cutting off his line of sight. I stood tall, my posture perfectly straight, channeling every ounce of strength and clarity I had gained over the past 20 days. I looked my father dead in the eye, feeling no sympathy, no lingering childhood obligation, and absolutely no desire to rescue him from his own blinding greed. "Apex Capital did not forgive the debt, Dad," I said, my voice ringing with a cold, lethal precision that commanded the entire room. I watched his brow furrow in confusion, a flicker of misunderstood hope dancing in his eyes, before I delivered the final fatal blow to his fabricated reality. "We bought it. The moment I completed the forensic audit and discovered that you and Mom had collateralized the historic North Shore mansion to fund a Ponzi scheme, I instructed Harrison to acquire the outstanding debt from your original predatory lenders. We purchased the entire $4 million loan portfolio." My mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as the true horror of my words registered in her mind. My father staggered backward as if I had physically struck him in the chest. "We are not just the firm that initiated the asset freeze on Dion." I continued, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum impact. "We are your new legal creditors now. We own the mortgage. We hold the absolute legal right to the property you carelessly gambled away to impress your wealthy friends." I did not give them a moment to process the power shift before laying down the brutal, unarguable terms of their new reality. Because the original loan was already in a state of catastrophic default, the legal process has already been expedited. The formal notice of foreclosure will be nailed to the front door of your beloved mansion at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. You will not have months to fight this in court. You will not have time to hide assets or beg your old friends for a bailout. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property." My father let out a quiet, agonizing sob, covering his face with his trembling hands. My mother simply stared at me. her eyes hollow and completely devoid of the haughty superiority she had worn like a crown for 33 years. Brittany remained on the floor weeping silently, a broken shell of a woman who had bet her entire life on a fraudulent illusion. They had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin, no more manipulations to deploy, and absolutely no more toxic leverage to hold over my head. I turned away from their shattered expressions and walked calmly toward the entryway of the apartment. I reached out, grasped the cold metal handle, and pulled the heavy front door wide open, revealing the empty, brightly lit hallway beyond. I looked back at the people who had brought me into this world, the people who had systematically tried to diminish my worth, and the people who had abandoned me at the church altar without a single ounce of regret. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute liberation wash through my veins. The seats at my wedding were empty. I said, my voice steady, clear, and utterly devoid of all emotion. The seats in my life are now empty too. Get out. 6 months passed since the night I purged the toxicity from my life forever. The bitter winter winds of Chicago had surrendered to a warm and vibrant summer, bringing a renewed energy to the city skyline. Harrison and I stood together on the expansive terrace of our newly completed penthouse, overlooking the magnificent shimmering expanse of Lake Michigan. The temporary apartment with its modest furnishings and heavy memories was a relic of the past. Our permanent home was a sprawling sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling glass, imported marble, and quiet, unshakable power. We had designed every single square inch of this space to reflect our shared values of transparency, strength, and absolute loyalty. A warm evening breeze drifted off the water, gently catching the edge of my silk evening gown. I rested my hands on the cool metal railing, feeling a profound sense of total tranquility that I had never experienced during my childhood. The frantic, exhausting noise of trying to earn the approval of people who were determined to misunderstand me had been completely silenced. I was no longer the overlooked accountant or the disappointing sister. I was the lead forensic investigator for the top private equity firm in the country, and I was the equal partner to the man standing faithfully by my side. Behind us in the massive open-concept living room, a large high-definition television was playing the evening financial news broadcast. The volume was kept low, but the crisp voices of the anchors carried clearly through the serene open space. The lead story of the hour was the final, highly anticipated conclusion to a federal fraud investigation that had captivated the business world. A polished news anchor looked directly into the camera, summarizing the catastrophic downfall of a once prominent Silicon Valley technology executive. The screen flashed a courtroom sketch of Dion. He was no longer wearing his custom-tailored linen suits or flashing his expensive luxury watches. He was depicted in a standard-issue federal prison uniform, his posture slumped and utterly defeated. The anchor reported that earlier this afternoon, a federal judge had officially sentenced him to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The prosecution had successfully utilized a mountain of irrefutable forensic accounting evidence detailing massive wire fraud, money laundering, and the gross embezzlement of private investor capital. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands had been fully seized and repatriated to the defrauded victims. Dion had lost his freedom, his fabricated empire, and every single trace of his stolen wealth. The broadcast then transitioned to a secondary segment, exploring the collateral damage caused by the fraudulent technology startup. The reporter discussed the numerous secondary victims who had blindly invested their life savings into the Ponzi scheme. My parents, Richard and Caroline, were not explicitly named, but the devastating reality of their current existence was perfectly clear to me. True to my word, the foreclosure notice had been nailed to the front door of their historic North Shore mansion at exactly 8 in the morning after our final confrontation. They had been given exactly 30 days to pack up their curated lives and vacate the property that Apex Capital legally possessed. Without Dion's stolen money or their leveraged equity, they experienced a rapid, brutal descent from the highest echelons of Chicago high society. They had been forced to relocate to a cramped, incredibly cheap rental apartment situated deep in the undesirable outskirts of the distant suburbs. Their exclusive country club memberships were immediately revoked. Their wealthy friends entirely abandoned them, treating their financial ruin like a highly contagious disease. Caroline could no longer host her lavish dinner parties or brag about her phenomenal social status. Richard could no longer posture as a titan of generational wealth. They were completely permanently isolated in their tiny suburban box, forced to confront the grim reality of their own blinding greed every single day for the rest of their miserable lives. The news segment shifted to a live reporter standing outside a generic, busy coffee shop, discussing the local economic impact of the fraud case. As the camera panned across the crowded background, a familiar face briefly flashed across the high-resolution screen. It was Brittany. The former golden child and glamorous lifestyle influencer was practically unrecognizable. She was wearing a stained brown apron over a plain uniform shirt, carrying a heavy tray of dirty coffee cups toward the kitchen. Her perfectly styled highlighted hair was pulled back into a messy practical knot, and her face was completely devoid of her usual expensive cosmetics. She looked exhausted, defeated, and entirely ordinary. The woman who had once mocked my simple wedding and bragged about her luxurious yacht parties was now wiping down sticky tables for minimum wage tips, desperately trying to survive the catastrophic ruin her husband had left behind. I watched my sister disappear from the screen, swallowed by her difficult new reality. I felt not a single ounce of pity or lingering resentment. I felt only the quiet, validating closure of absolute natural justice. I picked up the remote control and pressed the power button, instantly silencing the news broadcast and plunging the living room back into peaceful quiet. Harrison walked up behind me, wrapping his strong arms around my waist and resting his chin gently on my shoulder. He handed me a crystal flute filled with perfectly chilled vintage champagne. I turned slightly to face the man who had stood by me when the rest of the world walked away. I raised my glass and clinked it softly against his, the delicate chime ringing out over the distant sounds of the city below. We shared a slow, deep kiss, tasting the sweet champagne and the absolute certainty of our shared future. I turned back to the horizon, watching the city lights slowly illuminate the gathering dusk. I lost a deeply toxic, manipulative family, but in exchange, I built a massive, untouchable empire. Fade to black.